Every Wednesday morning, rain or shine, Margaret Harper made the same journey. Her worn canvas bag held a modest bundle of flowers, sometimes daisies from the corner shop, sometimes wildflowers she'd gathered along the roadside. At 63, with silver threading through her auburn hair and laugh lines etched deep around her eyes, she moved with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to carry loss with grace. The grave she visited bore the name Eliza Chase, etched in dark granite that caught the morning light. Margaret had never known this woman in life. But 5 years ago, when her own daughter Emily had been laid to rest just 3 rows away, she'd noticed this particular headstone, always bare, always forgotten. Week after week, Margaret would tend to Emily's flowers, then glance over at that lonely stone, and her heart would ache for the woman who rested there with no one to remember her. So one Wednesday, Margaret had brought extra flowers. Just a few stems, placed gently at the base of Eliza's headstone. The following week, she brought more. It became her ritual. Flowers for Emily, flowers for Eliza. 2 women she loved, in different ways. Margaret would kneel on the damp grass, her knees protesting a bit more each year, and talk softly to both of them. She'd tell Emily about her grandchildren, about the garden, about the small joys that filled her days. And she'd talk to Eliza, too, this stranger who had somehow become part of her weekly pilgrimage. "I brought you yellow roses today, Eliza," she'd say. They reminded me of sunshine. This particular Wednesday was gray and misty, the kind of morning where the fog settled low over the cemetery grounds. Margaret was arranging a small bouquet of mixed wildflowers at Eliza's grave when she heard footsteps behind her on the wet grass. She turned to see a tall man in a long, dark coat approaching, a little girl perched in his arms. The child couldn't have been more than 3, with blonde pigtails and pink shoes that caught Margaret's eye. The man stopped a few feet away, his expression puzzled but not unkind. He was perhaps 40, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, but his eyes held a deep weariness that Margaret recognized, the particular exhaustion of grief that time softens but never quite erases. "Excuse me," he said, his voice careful and controlled. That's my wife's grave, too." Margaret's hand went to her chest. "Your wife?" "Eliza." He gestured to the headstone with his free hand, the little girl watching Margaret with solemn blue eyes. "Eliza Chase, she is my wife. This is our daughter, Sophie." Margaret stood slowly, her mind racing. 5 years of flowers, 5 years of talking to a woman she'd thought was alone and forgotten. "I'm so sorry," she stammered. "I didn't mean to intrude. I thought no one came. I never saw anyone, and I couldn't bear to see her grave so bare, and—" The man held up his hand gently. "Please, don't apologize." His voice caught slightly. We live 3 hours away. My work, it's demanding. I'm CEO of a manufacturing company, and I travel constantly. Sophie was so young when Eliza passed, barely 6 months old. I bring her when I can, but it's not often enough. Maybe once every few months?" He paused, looking at the fresh flowers Margaret had just placed. "I've wondered about these flowers. For years now, whenever we visit, there are always fresh flowers. I thought perhaps it was a cemetery service, but they told me no." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "My daughter is buried just over there." She pointed to Emily's grave. "I come every week. And I started bringing flowers for your Eliza because everyone deserves to be remembered." The man's composure cracked. His jaw worked and he blinked rapidly. Little Sophie, sensing her father's emotion, patted his cheek with her small hand. "Daddy okay?" she said softly. "Yes, sweetheart." "Daddy's okay." He looked back at Margaret, and now his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I'm David Chase, and I don't know how to thank you. I've carried such guilt, knowing I couldn't be here more often, knowing Eliza lay here alone. But she hasn't been alone at all, has she?" Margaret shook her head, tears streaming freely now. "No, she's had company. I've told her about my week, about my grandchildren. I've told her jokes sometimes. I hoped somehow she didn't mind." David set Sophie down carefully, and the little girl immediately toddled to the flowers, touching them with wonder. "Pretty," she declared. "You're Eliza," Margaret said softly. What was she like? David's face transformed. She was sunshine. That's what I always called her. She lit up every room. She loved flowers, wildflowers especially. She said they were proof that beauty didn't need permission to exist. He laughed, though it came out shaky. She would have loved that you brought her flowers. She would have loved you. They stood together in the misty morning, two people bound by loss and by love, watching little Sophie examine each flower with 3-year-old intensity. Would you... David hesitated. Would you like to join us? Maybe you could tell me some of the things you've told Eliza, and I could tell you about her. It seems wrong that you've been caring for her all this time without knowing her. Margaret's smile was watery but genuine. I'd like that very much. They sat together on a nearby bench, Sophie between them, and David pulled out his phone to show Margaret pictures. Eliza at their wedding, radiant in white. Eliza pregnant, glowing and laughing. Eliza holding newborn Sophie, looking exhausted and utterly in love. She had complications during the delivery, David said quietly. She held on for 3 weeks, long enough to name Sophie. Long enough to make me promise I'd tell Sophie every day how much her mother loved her. And do you? Margaret asked gently. Every single day. He looked at his daughter, who was now making a flower crown from Margaret's wildflowers with the glorious impracticality of childhood. But it's hard to make her feel real when Sophie has no memories, when we can't come here often. Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. I keep a journal, she said. Nothing fancy, just thoughts, conversations. Some weeks I write down what I told Eliza about. Would you like to have it? So Sophie can know that her mother was visited every week? That she was loved by more than just you? David's hand trembled as he took the notebook. He opened it to a random page and read Margaret's neat handwriting. Brought Eliza daffodils today. Told her about how my grandson won his spelling bee. Told her I bet she'd be so proud of little Sophie, wherever that baby girl is now. Told her about the cardinal that's been visiting my feeder, so red and bright against the snow. I hope she can see it somehow. He closed the book carefully and pressed it to his chest. This is the most precious gift anyone could have given us. To know that someone cared, that someone talked to her. His voice broke. Thank you seems so inadequate. You don't need to thank me, Margaret said. Love isn't a burden. It's a privilege. Little Sophie tugged on Margaret's sleeve. You Mama's friend? Margaret looked at David, who nodded permission. She knelt to Sophie's level. Yes, sweetheart. I'm your Mama's friend, and I'd like to be your friend too, if that's okay. Sophie considered this with the seriousness only a 3-year-old can muster, then threw her arms around Margaret's neck. Okay. Over Sophie's shoulder, Margaret saw David wipe his eyes. When Sophie released her, he said, Would it be all right if we joined you sometimes? On Wednesdays? When I can manage it? I'd like Sophie to meet the woman who loved her mother without ever knowing her. I'd like that, Margaret said. I'd like that very much. As they prepared to part ways, David reached into his coat and pulled out a business card. Please, if you ever need anything. Anything at all. Margaret took the card politely, but shook her head with a gentle smile. I don't need anything, but I'll keep this so you have my number. And David, come when you can. Your Eliza will have flowers either way. David pulled her into an unexpected hug. She would have loved you, he whispered. She really would have. Margaret patted his back. I love her too. I truly do. As they walked away, Sophie turned back to wave, her little hand opening and closing. Bye, Mama's friend. Margaret waved back, then turned to both graves, Emily's and Eliza's. Well, she said softly, settling back down with her flowers. What an interesting morning we've had. You know, Emily, I think you'd like David and little Sophie. And Eliza, I hope you heard all that. I hope you know your daughter is beautiful, and your husband loves you still. The mist was lifting now, and thin sunlight broke through the clouds. Margaret finished arranging both sets of flowers, taking her time, finding comfort in the familiar ritual. As she gathered her things to leave, she noticed David had left something behind, a small photograph tucked carefully at the base of Eliza's headstone. It showed Eliza smiling, holding Sophie, with David's arms around them both, a family frozen in a moment of perfect joy. Margaret smiled through her tears. On the back, David had written, "Thank you for loving her. For loving us. David and Sophie." She carefully repositioned the photo so it wouldn't blow away, then stood and shouldered her bag. Next Wednesday, she'd bring yellow roses, Eliza's favorite, she now knew. And maybe David and Sophie would be there too. Maybe they'd share stories and create new memories in this quiet place where love persisted beyond loss. Because that's what love does, Margaret thought as she walked through the cemetery gates. It persists. It shows up. It brings flowers on Wednesday mornings, and sometimes, if you're very lucky, it brings you family you never expected to find.